Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, following today's program, we will post our event on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Leading our discussion and welcoming our special guest is Emily Gow. Emily serves as director of our Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She is an attorney who has defended religious freedom for the last 14 years. She has worked on behalf of victims of religious freedom violations in East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, South Asia, at the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. She has also worked at Beckett Law. She previously worked at the United Nations in Lanham and Watkins, and she has served as an adjunct professor of law at George Mason University's Law School. Please join me in welcoming Emily Gow. Emily?
Welcome to Heritage. Thank you very much, John. Heritage celebrates the initiative of Ambassador Sam Brownback and Secretary Mike Pompeo to elevate international religious freedom and to galvanize unprecedented bipartisan, multi-faith, international support for the protection of this fundamental right. We have enjoyed a wonderful week of discussions about international religious freedom with experts from diverse backgrounds and have been privileged to hear the personal stories of courageous people around the world who are standing up to religious repression in their countries. And we are delighted today to welcome a champion of international religious freedom, Congressman Robert Aderholt. He is in his 11th term representing Alabama's 4th Congressional District. In addition to being a member of the House Committee on Appropriations, Congressman Aderholt is also a member of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission. It was founded in 1976 and is comprised of 56 countries around the world that together monitor human rights in Europe and Central Asia. Prior to being elected to Congress, Mr. Aderholt served as an aide to Governor Fob James and as a judge in Alabama. He is a graduate of Birmingham Southern College and the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. Would you please join me in welcoming Representative Aderholt?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Emily. Appreciate the invitation to join you this afternoon and have a chance to talk about a real topic that's near and dear to so many of us, near and dear to our hearts. And also, just was pleased to be here with Dr. Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes has worked on the front line of the human rights in his role as executive director of the International Helsinki Federation for 14 years, and so it's good to have him here today, so it's good to be with you. As a member of the Helsinki Commission, the U.S. arm of the OSCE, I've seen firsthand the effect of the IHF's work in promoting freedom of thought, conscience, and religion across Europe. One of the reasons that I first got involved in the OSCE the arm here in the United States, was because of the human rights aspect and the religious freedom aspect that I thought was so vitally important. And that was around, I guess, about 2002 when I first got engaged with the Helsinki Commission and with the OSCE arm here in the United States, and have been involved ever since then. The International Helsinki Federation, of course, some of you will know, was formed in the aftermath of the signing of the Helsinki Final Act back on August the 1st, 1975. The Helsinki Accords in the Final Act marked a significant moment for freedom in Europe. The political agreement was signed by almost every European country, including the former Soviet Union, as well as the United States and Canada. Signatories agreed to 10 principles alongside a number of issues on the definition of borders and the peaceful settlement of disputes. One of the most important agreed upon principles was principle number 7. And I quote, "The participating states will respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion." By agreeing to the Helsinki Accords, the signatories, including at the time of, there were several Eastern European governments that, of course, as you know, at that time were very oppressive, and they assigned themselves to the human rights benchmark, to which outside groups could hold them accountable. The Helsinki Accords gave civil society network legitimacy, and in 1982, the International Helsinki Federation was formed to monitor human rights and the progress it was making among those who signed. Then later, in January of 1995, the Helsinki Conference transformed into the Organization for the Security and the Cooperation of Europe, which we know today. And to this day, the OSCE, as it's called, continues to bring additional security and prosperity to Europe, as well as building on the International Helsinki Federation's mission to promote full respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. There's one particular quote in Dr. Rhodes' book which stands out. When discussing the determination and resolve of human rights activists in the International Helsinki Federation, he made this remark, quote, "These people had little to lose except their principles, their most cherished possession, which they would not relinquish." End of quote. In the face of serious pressure, even the threat of death, these men and women worked tirelessly to uphold their beliefs and their values and to secure freedom in the darkest parts of Europe. So thank you, Dr. Rhodes, for your important work and which all of your colleagues have achieved. The subject of today's discussion is very important to me. Freedom of religious belief is a part of the fabric of our great nation. The pilgrims who embarked for the New World took the extremely dangerous journey in pursuit of that very prize, the ability to worship freely, to believe what they thought was right, and to practice this belief free from government interference and from hindrance. As our founding fathers went about building this new nation, one of the most important tasks was to protect this fundamental natural right. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In today's political climate, many have turned this statement into something that it's not. The concept of separation of church and state has prevailed over language protecting freedom of religion. The First Amendment does not demonize the role of religion in an individual's life. Quite the opposite. It states that the freedom of religious belief is a sacred right, so important to the life of the individual, it must be free from government interference. The First Amendment does not instruct religious belief to stay out of government. It ensures government stays out of people's religious beliefs. The fight to secure the most basic right is never ending. As President Reagan wisely noted, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Sadly, in recent years, we have seen an increase in oppressive regimes around the world and a weakening of people's freedoms. Freedom House notes that in the year, last year in 2017, that 71 countries suffered net declines in political rights and civil liberties. It was the 12th consecutive year of decline in global freedoms. In its 2018 report, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom concluded religious freedom conditions continue to deteriorate in countries around the globe in 2017. In India, for instance, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom reports that in 6 states, individuals wishing to convert from Hinduism to Christianity must register with local authorities. In Turkey, the wrongful imprisonment of Pastor Andrew Brunson has been a concern for so many of Americans, and so many Americans have been tracking that over the last several months. I was greatly relieved to see he was released from prison just yesterday, And of course, as you know, he does remain under house arrest. We will continue to advocate strongly for the Turkish authorities to resolve this case in a transparent and fair manner. In his strong remarks even this morning, Vice President Pence made clear that the administration's determination to bring about justice for Pastor Brunson, and we applaud the Vice President and this administration for holding their feet to the fire. Alongside these deeply concerning policy trends, we have also witnessed a shift in the language surrounding freedom of religious belief. Ironically, the principle of tolerance is often used as a tool to suppress freedom of religious belief, sometimes targeting conservative Christian values. In the recent case of the Masterpiece Cake Shop, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission did not practice religious neutrality in their initial decision. Many of us who believe in religious liberty are anxious to see the outcome of a very similar case in Northern Ireland just later this year. Without careful examination, policies aimed at promoting tolerance could soon outlaw core aspects of peaceful religious convictions. We cannot and we must not allow these deeply distressing trends to continue. That is why I'm so glad to see the first ever ministerial to advance religious freedom here in the United States this week. In the lead up to this conference, Secretary of State Pompeo made his long-term commitment to freedom of religious belief clear when he announced the following about the conference. Quote, "We will have our teams in the subsequent weeks and months in the field talking about religious freedom on a continued basis. We'll have just 3 days here, but it will be a mission of the State Department every day," end of quote. This morning, Secretary Pompeo confirmed the administration will make the ministerial to advance religious freedom an annual event. This is good news for freedom of religious belief literally across the world. I would encourage all the leaders that are present at this conference to go back to the renewed countries with renewed determination to make their mark and to secure freedom of religious belief everywhere. In the House Appropriations Committee, we recently approved the annual State and Foreign Operations Appropriation Bill. The bill included language to give USAID the flexibility they requested to be able to support and to protect persecuted groups that have been targeted by ISIS. I was pleased to work with this agency and the Appropriations Committee to ensure the inclusion of this very provision. As you know, these persecuted groups were forced from their homes and their communities because of their religion. In 2003, there was 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Today, there are between 200,000 and 300,000 Christians that are left in that country. That means over 1 million Christians were either killed or they fled the country in fear of their lives. Protecting these groups is not only the right thing to do, but it is vital for Iraq to be able to maintain a diverse, a stable, and politically viable country. I was therefore very happy to see that both President Trump and Vice President Pence have committed to do more and to work with faith-based groups to ensure those most affected by the recent genocide get the aid that they need. And we will continue to support and encourage them in their pursuit of religious belief. So thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and to speak about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and it is very near to many members' hearts. I can tell you that from my conversations with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis. Freedom of religious belief is a core foundation for a peaceful and a prosperous democracy. And I certainly want to encourage all of you to continue your work to preserve this most fundamental right. So may God bless you. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you again for the invitation to join you for a few minutes this afternoon to share my thoughts, and we look forward to working with you on this very important issue. Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to invite the panelists to join me on stage. As you may know, 2018 is a landmark year both for international human rights and international religious freedom. This is the 20th anniversary of when Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, and it's the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the UN General Assembly adopted in 1948, that created universal protection of the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion in Article 18. At this time, we thought it was important to both look back at some of the major trends in these movements, including the increasing politicization of both human rights and religious freedom, and to look ahead and to ask the question, how should we promote human rights to foster greater freedom for everyone to live according to their most cherished beliefs? I want to suggest 3 principles for us to consider. First, we should vigorously protect the freedom to seek truth about matters of ultimate importance, including the existence and the identity of God, and how the answers to this question should instruct our thoughts, our speech, and our actions in everyday life. This freedom is crucial to the flourishing of all human rights. The drafters of the Universal Declaration cited human dignity as the basis for all human rights. What evidence did they cite of our human dignity? In Article 1 of the Declaration, they did not cite a particular religion or a particular philosophy. Instead, they cited our ability to seek truth because we are, quote, endowed with reason and conscience, unquote. Therefore, the freedom to seek the truth and to live accordingly is not just what may make us religious, it is what makes us human. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is in the DNA of the entire human rights movement. Second, we must protect the freedom to seek the truth and the freedom to speak and to act according to our beliefs about the truth. Our freedom cannot be limited to a church or a mosque or a temple or a synagogue. We must be free to exercise this in the public square, and this is what Article 18 protects. Article 18 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights also adds that we should not be subject to coercion to adopt our beliefs or change our beliefs. And it also guarantees the right of parents to educate their children according to their religious and moral convictions. And finally, the freedom to live, to speak, and to act according to our beliefs must be protected at all times, even when there is disagreement, especially when there is disagreement, including on controversial matters like the existence and identity of God, human sexuality, marriage, and the family. Otherwise, it is meaningless. Today's panelists will address 2 trends that threaten freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. First, the ongoing inflation of human rights, the addition of new economic and social rights that are actually economic and social development goals that people can seek through the existence of our human rights, but that should not be confused with human rights themselves. And then second, the growing tendency to prioritize the beliefs of some identity groups over the freedom of individuals to hold and act upon their beliefs about sexuality, marriage, the family, and what it means to be male and female. Just 2 months ago, in his first report to the UN Human Rights Council, the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity encouraged states to, quote, adopt legislation in relation to hate speech on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, and to hold to account those responsible, including political or religious leaders, close quote. In light of these trends, we are fortunate to have 3 experts in human rights, economic development, and international law to address these questions. I'll start with introducing each speaker individually before they speak. Dr. Rhodes is an international human rights activist, university lecturer, and essayist based in Hamburg, Germany. He is president of the Forum for Religious Freedom Europe, an independent NGO. He served as director of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights, as was mentioned. He has promoted human rights all around the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. He was educated at Rhodes Reed College and received his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rhodes.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you for your work and your engagement in human rights. Can everybody hear me properly? Because it says here, keep your mic close to you. Is it close enough? Okay. Okay, I'm going to read a short paper. I don't mean, getting on in years, I don't really trust myself to ad lib anymore. And the title of the paper is Human Rights versus Freedom of Religion. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by this. Why do we care so deeply about freedom of religion? Here in Washington over the past few days, many authoritative and sincere voices have affirmed the freedom of religion as a fundamental human right, as a priority for the United States government and its citizens, and as a priority for other states as well. And I can tell you that in my work in international human rights over several decades, nothing has moved me, nothing has enraged me or motivated me more like violations of religious freedom. Some time ago, I interviewed around 200 members of the Ahmadi community in Pakistan, and the Ahmadi community is an Islamic sect. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's a sect, and by the way, there are about 70 sects in Islam. And these 200 people had all been subjected to grave violations of their religious freedom. And among them was an 8-year-old boy. He had shown great promise in school, but teachers abused him, humiliated him, and held him back because of his faith. His family was desperate about his future, and the injustice of this was unbearable to hear. And although I've had the difficult duty to interview many victims of torture and other abuses, just hearing about it made me feel as if I was suffocating. Violations of religious freedom are violations of our spirit. Religious freedom is the freedom to discern what is moral and to make moral choices. The sacredness of personality is a central principle of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and one that applies to all people. The principle of liberty, the core of human rights, human or natural rights, derives from the claim that our personal relationship to the divine, to ultimate and sacred things, and our quest for truth can't be violated without committing a crime against nature itself. People forced to give up their associations, their communications, their freedom of movement, their physical liberty, can nevertheless survive with integrity, even with a form of inner freedom. And you can read this in the accounts of people who have been in the Auschwitz concentration camp. They were deprived of everything, but they still had their intellectual and moral freedom. But we cannot give up our beliefs. We can't do this even if we try. We can only pretend to do so and thus humiliate ourselves. We can only trade the oppression of the state for oppression by ourselves. No religious person can hide from God. No secular person can be forced to believe. And now I want to talk to you about the proliferation of human rights in the international system. Freedom of religion is thus arguably the most important human rights, yet it is among the most violated. And that is no coincidence. Today, almost half the nations on earth, all of them undemocratic states, impose heavy restrictions on freedom of religion, and the struggle for religious freedom, while not political, is an obstacle to authoritarian rule in all those countries. And this brings me to the first point I want to make in support of my paradoxical title: how human rights, as now conceived, fail to protect the freedom of religion and can even violate that freedom. The increasing abuses of religious liberty take place while there are more human rights laws, processes, and institutions, more high-level human rights officials, and more national and international human rights bureaucracy. Leszek Balcerowicz, the brilliant Polish economist, observed that today we have more rights but less freedom. My colleagues Jacob Mishangama and Guglielmo Verderame counted 667 human rights provisions in United Nations treaties and 710 in those of the Council of Europe, while the human rights of Americans are protected by only 10 constitutional amendments. There are new unnecessary UN treaties in the pipeline, by the way, like a treaty for the protection of the rights of peasants, and they proceed toward ratification because states do not have the political courage to stop the juggernaut or understand why they should. The mainstream human rights community shrugs this off, but the problem with human rights proliferation is human rights inflation. The currency of human rights has lost value as more rights have been proclaimed, and human rights inflation has also occurred through ideological and irresponsible activist judicial interpretation, whereby judges create new human rights and change the meaning of existing rights. And now I want to talk to you about natural rights a little bit. Diplomats from unfree states like to run down the clock at the UN with discussions about technical assistance programs, national human rights institutions, sovereign debt, and other topics, and to avoid the issue of freedom. The proliferation and dilution of human rights and religious freedom is a desired goal of abusive governments, and one enthusiastically supported by useful idiots in liberal democracies who see in human rights a way to promote political goals and build a global regulatory utopia. I attribute this destructive trend to the international community in 1948, having named economic and social rights as human rights. Today, we see the consequences of that error. The vast proliferation of human rights has been in the expansion of economic and social rights, in collective rights, not in individual rights that are the focus of the foundation of the UN itself. All governments, including the United States government, take positive steps to secure the welfare of their citizens. Governments and legislative bodies create laws to do so, laws that require compromises and trade-offs by which resources are transformed from some to the others. And I'm not arguing against welfare here. I'm not arguing against Social Security or any social programs that we vote on to help our fellow citizens. But these welfare rights are rights. They are not universal human rights. True human rights are natural rights, rights that are universally held prior to any government and outside any social or cultural context, rights that are inherent, rooted in the natural order of which our common human nature is a part. Natural rights, including the freedom of religion, are sacrosanct. If our common human nature is to be respected, they cannot be violated or subordinated to other goals. We use our human rights in the political arena to express our political principles and to secure our social goals. There is a profound difference between these two kinds of rights, but today it has been fogged in and obscured by the UN dogma of the universality, of the indivisibility and equality of all human rights. And this is a real threat to the freedom of religion. Today, sadly, human rights have become detached from natural rights, and thus basic rights and freedoms are seen not as intrinsic and inalienable, but rather as optional and arbitrary and ideological in nature, like economic and social rights. The German Catholic philosopher Max Scheler showed the psychodynamics of this syndrome in his book Ressentiment. The very idea of natural rights is run down by those who cannot understand it or who envy it, perhaps because they find in it evidence of something lacking in themselves, the capacity to understand the foundations of transcendent values. More and more human rights have entered into international law, yet UN human rights dogma holds that all human rights are to be treated equally. the implications are absurd. For example, the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights protects, quote, the right to access a free employment service as a fundamental human right. Is the right to employment counseling just as important, just as paramount as the prohibition against slavery or the right to freedom of religion? Or put another way, are those rights no more important than publicly funded employment counseling? What is more, the freedom of religion, as well as other basic rights, is subject to conditions and derogations in human rights treaties and national law, which may be a consequence of the expansion of human rights and the loss of the principle of inviolable natural rights. The European Convention on Human Rights, set up as a bulwark against totalitarianism, confirmed that everyone has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But then it goes on to say that this freedom can be limited in the interests of public safety, the protection of public order, health, or morals, and for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. These are rather vague. It is too easy for the European Court to uphold interferences in religious affairs. Meanwhile, numerous European states are passing highly dubious laws restricting harmless manifestations of Islamic faith. And the European Court has given the green light for the process, one that Mira Sukharov, writing in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, called, quote, part of an ongoing attempt to shame, provoke, and marginalize Muslims. Finally, how often we catch ourselves defending the freedom of religion because it is good for democracy, stability in the economy. Well, it is, in fact. But that's not the point, though. Professor Marco Ventura in Brussels has observed that the freedom of religion is considered of value insofar as it is instrumental for other purposes. Indeed, all basic human liberties are commonly approached in this utilitarian manner. But the fact is that the free exercise of religion cannot be depended upon to produce desired results. It is precious for what it is, not for what it does. And let me conclude by saying that this is obviously not a time to be complacent about human rights or to simply blame the state of human rights on bad actors. The bad actors are going to be with us like the poor, always. We speak about defending the freedom of religion as a human right, but how do we defend the idea of human rights? The adulterated concept of human rights and the corrupted human rights system have become obstacles to human rights because they debase the meaning of human rights and give cover to human rights abusers and to those who seek to exploit human rights to achieve political goals. Many observers today warn that the so-called rule-based international order is coming apart. International human rights institutions have lost credibility, and whatever our approach may be to dealing with this fluid situation, it is clear that to improve human rights practice, we must clarify our discourse. In the big picture, to improve enjoyment of religious freedom, we must recover the meaning of human rights. And while governments need to be held accountable for their abuses, that is a challenge for civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. I'm going to ask that please hold your applause until the very end of the event so that we can make sure to have enough time for your questions. So next, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Shay Garrison, who is an international development professional who focuses on sustainable economic and social development and gender equality. She's worked extensively in the Middle East and Africa and was a visiting research fellow at the Center for Gulf Studies at the American University in Kuwait. She is currently senior advisor for foreign affairs for Concerned Women for America and an affiliated faculty and policy fellow at George Mason University's School of Policy and Government.
Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me? I want to speak to you today to add to what Dr. Rhodes has said, and within the context of, as Emily said, my experience as a development practitioner and academic. In the international arena, the concept of human rights has increasingly become so watered down that it's hard for the practitioner and the policymaker to recognize the difference between transcendent, or what I believe are God-given rights of the individual, and the things that we call rights that are actually only the interests of certain groups of society. And I would like to thank Dr. Rhodes for his work, because he has helped me to articulate my frustrations in this area and also to think of ways to better respond. I am going to talk now about 2 additional points which I believe are important in shaping human rights concepts and goals and advancing religious freedom. So first thing I'd like to answer is, are economic and social goals human rights, following on Dr. Rhodes? For rights practitioners and policy makers, answering this question is not just an exercise in theory. It is an exercise in practical application. If we better understand the difference between these 2 sets of rights, natural rights or economic and social rights, we will understand the importance of these, and this will help us determine where we put our time, our attention, and our funding. Dr. Rhodes refers to the necessity of dividing these rights and says that if we don't do that, we reap the consequences of more human rights violations. And I believe you said this in your book, Dr. Rhodes, and I highly recommend that you read that. Although I believe he is correct, and mainly is referring to a division of natural rights and economic and social rights named in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when we do speak about this issue to others, we should be cautious about how we use the phrase economic and social rights. Some rights termed this are actually human rights. For example, the term economic rights doesn't only refer to social welfare entitlements. In my world of international development and women's empowerment, for example, economic rights activists work to increase women's equal access and participation to labor markets, to labor force participation, business ownership and entrepreneurship, and also to decrease gender barriers to inequality. Economic rights also include the right to own property, the right to fair wages, and the abolishment of slave labor or labor exploitation. These are fundamental human rights of equality and opportunity that women in many countries don't have. In this way, social and economic rights are not collective rights. They are the right of the individual to participate, to own, and to have equal opportunity in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, as we call it. So in the sense that women's rights and gender equality seek to advance the equality of the sexes and not to advance the interests of certain political or identity groups, women's rights are, as Hillary Clinton once said, human rights. My second point, do then economic and social goals matter? Well, our discussion on the need to differentiate between these types of rights does not imply incompatibility between the 2, as Dr. Rhodes referred to. Rather, the assurance of our natural rights, such as, for example, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience and belief, allows an individual the vehicle to express and strive for the economic or social goals that they desire. In other words, this is what people can do with their freedoms. In his book, Dr. Rhodes also points out that whether or not protecting human rights leads to a better society, they should be protected. And he said today, and I love this phrase, religious freedom is precious for what it is, not for what it does. And I quite agree with him. However, in the fight to advance religious freedom, I believe we've got to be pragmatic as well. Yes, we've got to better clarify our human rights discourse and recover the meaning of human rights to improve our defense of international religious freedom. But we also have to show governments that it is indeed in their best interest, and to equip policymakers and practitioners with a dialogue to convince countries, especially those that are not inclined to the vast majority of basic human rights. So let's discuss then, does religious freedom lead to better social and economic well-being of societies? I believe the ability to exercise our natural freedoms, such as religious liberty, is itself an improvement to society, but also it's an engine driving society's well-being. In international development theory, for example, we promote community participation. It's called participatory theory, as the most effective means to sustainable economic and social development. A great deal of an individual's success in improving their own living standards rests on whether or not society allows and supports the exercise of their personal rights, such as the capacity for taking part in creating their own livelihoods, governing their own affairs, and participating in self-government. So in this way, an individual is an active agent of change for their community and can participate in impelling the progress of opportunities. In practical terms, what this means is that the added economic and social participation of religious minority communities can increase productivity of a country. We've seen this happen in many societies where they are discriminated from even the economic spheres and the social and civic spheres of society. But if a large percentage of the working age population is unemployed or even underemployed because of discrimination, as we see, this indicates significant underuse of a country's potential labor force and undermines the economic potential of a country. And this is something that the World Bank as well talks about, and the international labor force participation. So in summary, a country that doesn't use its population to its full advantage in the labor force won't reap full production or income earning potential.